So when it comes to the BBC, they don't like to give you much information. I mean, we only pay them billions of pounds every single year, so it is quite annoying that they are pretty secretive. But I've just found a freedom of information request where it does take them quite a while to get the answer, but the BBC do actually provide quite a lot of details. And it involves Gary Lineker and his social media policy. Because the guy asks, he says, "Dear BBC, a Daily Telegraph article was published on the 7th of February. Obviously that's quite a while ago now. But it says at an event held by the Broadcasting Press Guild, the match of the day man," which obviously that's Gary Lineker, was asked what he thought about the BBC's new social media guidelines for star presenters who work outside news and current affairs. And he calls him Saint Gary. But Gary Lineker says about these BBC social media guidelines, he says, "I was partly involved in drawing them up." And that's why it's always important as well, just on a side note. When you do see articles, it is important to just genuinely read them, because it can just be one line like that. What on earth is Gary Lineker doing drawing up the social media plans for the BBC? But this guy here, in all fairness, he just picked up on this one line. And like I said, it is actually pretty telling. But he says please provide all and any documentation relating to Lineker's involvement. Essentially, he wants to know, and rightly so, he wants to know how much Gary Lineker has played a part in drawing up these rules. I mean, in all fairness, he did say the line himself. Actually, yeah, there's the line there in the article. It says, so he wasn't calling him, so what is Saint Gary? Saint Gary Lineker? Why would you call him Saint Gary? T. Gary seems to be the same. Who's S.T. Gary? So I've just Googled that. Obviously, I'm not going to spend too long Googling it because I'm trying to make a video. But yeah, I can't see why they would call him Saint Gary in a Telegraph article. That's just really weird. I wonder if he wrote that policy as well. But basically, this guy puts the Freedom of Information request, and this was on the 7th of February. This is just them acknowledging it. This is the FOI people from the BBC. Essentially, thank you for your request, and it was received on the 7th of February, and that they will deal with the request as promptly as possible, at the latest within 20 working days. So 20 working days. So our friend here, he actually gives them just over 30, because this is the 9th of March now. And he puts that quote, this guy likes his quotes, I like this guy. But he puts at the latest within 20 working days. He says, what did you actually mean by that? And the BBC respond, this is a couple of days later. And like I said, we do actually get a detailed response in the end, which we will get to. But they say, please accept our apologies for the delay. We're continuing to process your request. So he now comes back saying 30 working days have now passed. Now, just under a week later, he does look like he wants to escalate it. Because all he wants to do is just figure out how much Gary Lineker has played a part in this. But 36 working days later, and nothing has been given. So the BBC come back once again. They say, we will aim to respond within 20 working days of the receipt. But they say it can take up to 40 working days for complex reviews. We're already on 36. In fact, 26th of March. So yeah, we're already on 36, and now they're saying it could take up to 40. But then the person who asked the question, he comes back and he says, look, it's now 40 working days. And he uses that quote again, at the latest within 20 working days. And this is on now the 15th of April. He says, are we at 50 working days since I first submitted my FOI request? Oh, Captain Sarcasm. Perhaps you would like to tell me what is going on and why my request has been so difficult to deal with, but more likely, you will not. Then he gives them another week, and it's and so it goes on. Despite your claim, we will aim to respond within 20 working days of receipt. I note that more than 20 working days have now passed. He puts, while I can accept that it can take up to 40 working days for complex reviews, he's still no closer to the information. Then we get this response here, right? So this is 25th of April. So again, the original one, it was 7th of February that it was put in. 7th of Feb. But this is the initial response from the BBC. It's basically another acknowledgement letter. So his question is basically here. This section here is his question. It's still his wording. They're giving him no answer. They're just acknowledging that he wants a review. So he's still no closer. It just basically, obviously I'm not going to read that whole thing out. Many would, but I'm not going to. And they basically just go on about the time frame. So if we go back and see where they are now. So that was 25th of April. So he comes back, and again, rightly so. He says, "Your internal review does not actually tell me anything that I didn't know already." And he says, "You have failed to respond in the allotted time, and there's still no explanation for the delay." And he says, "As we approach 60 days since I originally submitted my request," he puts, "as my French son would say, get on with it." This is why you should start doing freedom of information requests, and you shouldn't let them boss you about as well, because they will try and get out of all of the information. So this is just under another week. And again, he just wants another review. He just wants his information, but it looks like he'll take a review as well. Then they come back and say, again, "Thank you for your request for an internal review." Which, honestly, it's just going around it. Again, all he wants to do is just find out what Gary Lineker meant when he said, "I was partly involved in drawing up the BBC's guidelines." That's all he wants to know. Turns out it's very difficult. And he puts nearly 70 days after I first submitted my request on the 7th of Feb. He says, "I'm curious and obviously misunderstanding something. So please provide your exact and specific definition of the term 40 working days." So they come back a couple of days later. This is the BBC again. They sort of talk internally. They put, "We're very sorry." I'm sure they are. "They're very sorry for our continued delay." And they make the final promise of responding to the request by the 24th of May. And to their credit, they actually do. And not only that, it is a very comprehensive response. Because we'll have a look at it here. Obviously, I'm not going to read the whole thing out. But this was his initial request. I'll highlight that in blue. This section here is just them talking about what they can and can't include. Like, we have omitted exchanges of correspondence, whose purpose is simply to agree with arrangements for meetings, such as dates, locations, and travel arrangements. So they will include some information, but they won't include everything. But I'll put the response on screen here. I'm trying to fit it all on one screen. I'll probably cut it into 2 sections and I'll just put it on screen so it's easier to see. But it does go on, like I said, about some pretty internal stuff, which is why we should always ask for freedom of information requests, because you really don't know what you're going to find out. But like I said, if you want to pause it and read it on screen, you're more than welcome to. But it says Mr. Hardy, which is one of the BBC's internal guys. He says that he initially met with Mr. Lineker's agents on the 5th and the 18th of April. Then he met with Lineker directly on the 25th of April. And it says the purpose of these meetings was for Mr. Lineker, apparently known as St. Gary, and his agents to offer their views on the existing BBC's social media guidelines. Then it goes on to talk about another meeting internally that was done by Gary Lineker and his agents, as well as Mr. Hardy and 2 other senior BBC executives. So like I said, it is some pretty internal stuff that they were able to get. And it says that he presented a final draft to the BBC's executive committee on the 7th of July. And the conclusion was that basically the social media for the BBC was completely unchanged and that no substantive changes were made to the report. So essentially nobody likes the BBC social media policy. Then they spoke to Gary Lineker, who no doubt sat there and just said that he wants to talk about everything, with the most cringe opinions on earth, whilst we pay his wages. Then the BBC just decided to not change the guidelines at all. And because the guy does finally get his response in the end, he says, "Dear FOI inquiries, thank you for your informative, if delayed, response to my FOI request that I made nearly 4 months ago." So like I said, it did take quite a while to get the information, but he did get some decent internal stuff. So if there's any questions that you can think of, I would highly recommend to visit this website and try and make a freedom of information request. And if you really can't be bothered, which I do fully understand, then just leave your request in the comments and I'll do my best to make the request myself. So, thank you for becoming one of the 35,733 subscribers. Thank you to the channel members, and thank you for checking out this video on screen. 60 days to respond. They're going crazy.
This country has gone crazy.